Yep, that's
Yep.
my
Hello, testing, 1, 2, 3, testing.
Really clear.
Welcome everybody. If you missed all that, I think everything's working now, except I can't see virtual hands because Rapia is going to draw my attention to anyone who puts their hand up virtually. I hope. Yeah, great. Minutes of the previous meetings. There are none for approval. I see here. I don't know quite that was, but we must have done a lot. And then this brings us to responsible investment policy. Now, I apologise again that this report was very late going out. That's because we were waiting for some news on the carbon position, which I'll let Rachel tell you all about in a minute, but it's good news. And I'd just point out that the remainder of the responsible investment policy is largely as we've discussed previously, so there shouldn't be any horrible surprise there. And I hope you had a chance to have a quick look at that, but we can deal with any questions on it as we go through. So, Rachel, are you going to introduce this, and you're going to do it in two bits? You're going to do true cost and then talk about the responsible investment policy, or what?
Yes.
I'll leave it to you, but Rachel.
No, I can do if that's easiest. We can talk through the sort of true cost and carbon target element first. Go for any questions, and then go on to look at the RI policy. So I don't know. Hopefully, people have had a chance to have a quick look at item 4. Again, apologies that this did go out so late. As the chair's mentioned, though, it does luckily set out some good news. So I'm conscious that not everybody here was actually on this committee back in 2016 when we set this target. So essentially carbon reduction, it was something that we really started to talk about in earnest sort of 2015 2016, when it became clear that we did actually have within our portfolio really quite a lot of exposure to some quite very carbon intense industries, and so as set out in the paper, what you'll see is that we originally held a strategy meeting in January of 2016 and set ourselves a number of commitments with regard to carbon risk that we were going to deliver. So all of those we have now completed work on. So we introduced fairly early on the carbon reduction policy statement and the investment strategy statement. We commissioned a carbon footprint report, which we'll talk more about in a moment. And then following on from that, we reviewed a number of our equity strategies, and also stepped up our involvement with the Local Authority Pension Fund Forum. So Rob is now very involved with that. So we set these commitments for ourselves, and in the summer of 2016, we commissioned True Cost to carry out our first carbon risk audit. So that covered a number of metrics in relation to exposure to carbon reserves, so oil, gas, and coal reserves, which obviously are mostly held by oil and gas companies, coal miners, general miners, and then it also looked at emissions from the companies held within our portfolio. What it is worth noting is that the type of information that it was possible to measure in terms of carbon exposure was very different back in 2016 to now. The range of metrics available now has hugely expanded. It's a completely different world in terms of sort of what you can measure, and in terms of sort of, I would say, the expectations on funds. So back in 2016, when we did this, it was really quite unusual to measure your carbon exposure. We did look a bit odd doing it. We were one of the first LGPS funds to do so. Which we are quite proud of, and so it's something that's really gained an awful lot of traction over 6 years. So what we did is we did the initial audit back in 2016, and working from that audit, we chose to set ourselves a measurable target based on the metric that we felt sort of best represented at that time the financial risk to the fund. So what we chose to look at was exposure to reserves, which we felt could be used as sort of proxy for stranded assets. So oil, gas, and coal assets that potentially down the line may not be worth as much as the underlying companies thought they were in 2016. So we felt it was a metric that reflected the financial interests of the fund. So we had that measured in 2016. And then we set ourselves an interim deadline of 3 years and a final target date of 6 years. So we've actually reported on this very slightly early. 3 years ago, when we looked at it, we found that we'd made some changes to investment strategy in the 3 years. So we'd reduced our UK exposure from 25% down to 10%. And we've made a couple of other changes. So looking at specifically low carbon or sustainable funds. So we've moved into the MSCI Low Carbon Passive Tracker, and we'd also moved to RBC's Global Sustainable Equity Fund. And we found that doing that reduced our exposure by about 31%. So we were over halfway to our 50% reduction target. Obviously, in the sort of 2.5 years since then, we've made a number of further changes. So crucially, what's happened is we have now removed dedicated UK exposure from the fund. So our equity exposure is now either via global equity or emerging markets equity mandates. And the other really big change that we've made is that we've moved first of all into a Paris-aligned equity fund through the London CIB, and we have also, and this sounds a less obvious change, but it has made a really significant difference. Is that we have moved our emerging markets equity mandate onto the CIB. What that's essentially done is it's necessitated a change of manager, and it's required a change in the underlying assets. And one of the underlying assets within the previous emerging markets portfolio, which caused us generated an awful lot of discussion at the time, was an Indonesian coal company. So one of the side effects of our move to pool our emerging market strategy has been that we have actually sold that company. And what that's done is all of those changes combined have made a really significant change to our exposure. So we've actually been able to reduce by around 97%, which is, we're really pleased that that's been the outcome. I think carrying out the audit definitely highlighted to us that not only did we have an awful lot of exposure within certain portfolios to industries that maybe we wanted to hold a little bit less of, but it also highlighted where across our equity mandates we actually had a number of overlapping exposures as well. So it's really helpful to be able to look at those in further detail and be able to reduce some of those risks. So yeah, we're really pleased to have exceeded our target in that way. So you'll note in the recommendations section that you're asked to note the reduction. I don't know if anyone has any questions on that section, or if you'd like me to talk a little bit more about some of the other recommendations in relation to where we go from here.
Thank you very much, and can I just say it's a really very good result indeed, and thank all our officers and advisors for magnificent achievement.
Yeah, sure.
Do you got any questions? Sorry?
Jonathan, please. Jonathan.
Yeah, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you, Cam. Thank you, Chair. Rachel, that's good to know, but my question is about performance and relative performance. You may well be coming onto that in due course, but that's an issue that I've got from my scheme member representative perspective. Thanks.
So no, I mean, I'm happy to answer the question. Michael might be able to give you, maybe not, might be able to give you this year's figure, which I don't have. But what I do know is that our, so obviously we track our performance relative to our LGPS peers. And whether or not it has anything to do with the carbon reduction, it did actually improve over the 6 years since we've set the target. So
yeah. So less carbon, better performance. Okay.
And we've continued to outperform the benchmark basically over the last year and 3 years, definitely. So.
Did you hear that? Okay. I think Henry wanted to. I know Jonathan wants to come back. Go on then, quickly, Jonathan. Henry wants to speak as well. Go on, Jonathan.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, come on. We know that there are an awful lot of benchmarks out there. The fact that Hackney was first and foremost in terms of adopting a low carbon attitude does us credit. However, why are we simply benchmarking ourselves against LGPS peers? I would imagine that's England and Wales. There are other members of the LGPS. And also, I'd be interested to know how we stack up against perhaps a rather more demanding set of comparators. Thanks.
There are another number of assertions in that question which I won't challenge, but if anyone wants to address it.
I mean,
I don't know what to say really.
Jonathan,
we're doing well. There's no doubt about it. Go on.
Jonathan, in terms of the LGPS peers comparison, it's simply that is one of the benchmarking services we are signed up to. It's helpful from the point of view that obviously it does give you an indication of how the fund has performed. Relative to essentially funds of a similar size, and also funds who are in a similar place within their life cycle as a pension fund. Obviously, comparing performance between the challenge in terms of performance comparisons is that there are not all that many pension funds out there that looking at defined benefit pension funds that are still open to new members as well as existing members, and obviously that does have a significant influence on investment strategy. So that's the reason why there is a bit of a focus on benchmarking to LGPS peers. It's because we do like to look at funds who are more likely to have a similar investment strategy and risk appetite to us. You know, comparing us to a private sector DB scheme that's either closed altogether or closed to new membership. It's a more difficult comparison because the investment strategies usually look entirely different.
Okay, yeah. Henry.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I find on this particular issue, I'm less concerned about the actual benchmarks than the absolute performance compared to our estimated liabilities. So on the face of it, this is an incredibly impressive result that we've done this 97% sort of cut and actually now exceeded our funding levels now over 100%. So I think that's an incredibly impressive effort. I guess where I was going to come from was that, and I don't necessarily expect an answer now. Rachel might want to take it later. One, actually, given the advance over the last 5 years, are the new metrics that we can use to double check our assumptions that we're 96 or 97% improved? Two, how can we value our redundant reserves, which you picked up in areas like oil and gas or whatever, just to make sure that our funding assumptions are still correct? And thirdly, what is the target for this remaining 3%? Should we be setting ourselves a new target for that, underneath an overall umbrella that we want to keep our funding levels at or close to or just over 100%?
Andrew wants to come in. Can we take Andrew, and then if Rachel goes back after that? Andrew.
I was maybe just going to add one point in response to Jonathan's question, and that is just in terms of relative performance for the managers who have been in place over that duration, relative to their benchmarks, so their mandate benchmarks, they have all exceeded their benchmark performance over that time period. So it's just a small additional point to the good points that Rachel was making.
Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, right, I can now see electronic hands, by the way. But so we have the technology. Rachel.
So I think in response to Henry's question, I think the best approach is probably to look at it through looking at some of the additional recommendations that we've set out.
Yes.
So in particular, looking at the recommendation around TCFD. So the position that we're in is obviously we have, we're really pleased to have exceeded the target on the metric that we used 6 years ago. What I would say is that things obviously sort of carbon risk measurement has changed hugely over that 6 years. So 6 years ago, we were one of the first LGP funds to set ourselves a target, and at that time we used a single metric. And we used the single metric that we felt was at the time, it felt like the best reflection of sort of where the financial risk might lie for the fund. And obviously, as things tend to do, the background to all of this has changed really considerably in the 6 years. So not least in that it's, looking at and assessing your carbon risk is becoming more and more mainstream. That data is more and more widely available. It is becoming cheaper to do it. So you'll note that we carried out 3 exercises over the 6 year period. The position that we're in now is the data is much more widely available. It is easier to get hold of. It's cheaper. It's offered by more organisations. Essentially, it is now the type of data that we can start to look and think we can now do this. We can do this more regularly, rather than this be something that we do sort of every 3 years or so as a major exercise. It's something that we should actually be looking to monitor on an ongoing basis, and that should be, from a practical perspective, feasible. The other big change is obviously that more and more guidance is now available to asset owners on how to do this. What should you look at? What data is available? And one of the most widely known of those is the recommendations from the TCFD, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is not DCAT's name, but it is widely recognised, and it is something that, as asset owners, we are encouraged to use. And what that recommends is essentially it recommends using a whole whole matrix of carbon metrics. So you're not looking just at stranded assets, but you're also looking at emissions from the underlying companies. You're looking at reserves, and you're starting to look at, what strategies do our underlying investee companies have in place to achieve alignment with the Paris Agreement. So there's an awful lot more we can measure now, and we can do so more frequently. So I think it's very much, rather than say the concentration on the 3%, which is that 3% it's a reflection of our risk of holding on to stranded assets, which I think, given the reduction, we can now regard as reasonably low. What I think we'd like to do is broaden that out and start looking at how underlying companies are preparing for transition, and how they are looking to align with the Paris Agreement, and that's what the TCFD recommendations are really driving at. So I would say it's a shift in emphasis more than anything. That's really being driven by the fact that, sort of, in terms of what the investment industry is doing about this, there's so much more available, but also, back when we set this target, there was really no guidance for asset owners on what you ought to do. It was very much, you could look at the data that was available and sort of think, well, what might best reflect our risk, but you were very much on your own in doing it. Whereas now there's actually an awful lot of guidance available, that sort of very strongly suggest, well, this is what we should do. And there's also the added incentive of really of comparability. You know, if more and more asset owners do this, then you can actually start to look again. It's sort of, okay, what do our peers in this space do? Where do people's risk appetites lie? You can learn an awful lot more about what other asset owners are doing as well. So that's really where that recommendation comes from. So what we've set out here is to say, you know, is really to try and set a general overarching ambition to say, yes, that we ought to align with the council's commitment to deliver net zero by 2040. And then, in line with the IPCC's recommendation, aligned to a 1.5 degree warming scenario. And to support that, look at more frequent measurement and monitoring in line with the TCFD recommendations.
That's brilliant. That's really helpful. Right. So if you can carry on the discussion and focus perhaps on what we do next as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, can I welcome that approach? And I think, as you've just said, Chair, it's now looking at the future. And this is going to become a very contested area, it seems to me. And it's very important that we are quite specific in both the approach and the measurement. And I guess what would be helpful to see, as well as this sort of overarching targets, the net zero and more frequent commitment, actually some of the more detailed sieve or criteria that we might apply. And could we look at that? Because I do think we can play an active role. We've got the credibility in the sense that we've done and achieved and been at the front of something. Now, I think this is going to be very active, the discussion and debate about intervention. The debate about BlackRock, for example, that's come up this week, where there is clearly going to be a ferocious struggle between people hanging on and BlackRock. Not sure which way it's going to go. Is it going to commit to this? So we need to keep, I think, a very close eye on this process, both from the intermediate management agent and what is happening at the front line. So can I suggest, Chair, that we within the framework that Rachel suggested, that we have a more detailed suggestion about the judgments that we can make in the more detailed way that you've talked about.
I guess we were planning to do most of that in June anyway.
Yes, so it's,
but if you want to just say what your plans are.
That's it. I mean, what you've described is very much what the TCFD recommendations set out. They are quite detailed.
And those would be the framework within which we judge our.
So it's, and the reason that I think we are inclined towards that framework is because it's one of the most widely recognised, and it's where some of the, if you look at where sort of some of the larger schemes who are really concerned about this and are looking, it is there. That's sort of where the sort of there's a sort of natural gravity that seems to be pulling people towards that. That does seem to be the most natural pathway for asset owners at the moment. There isn't guidance at the moment telling you that you must, but certainly it is now implied that you should.
So we're an active member of this.
Simon wants to come in. Simon Jones.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, just I guess building on what Rachel's been saying. The expectation is the TCFD requirement on LGPS is going to become a requirement rather than a nice to have. The overlap between the TCFD requirements and the net zero frameworks are quite substantive, but I think in addition to building on monitoring backwards looking type parameters, so what are our residual emissions, and not just within our equity portfolio but also across the entirety of the assets. So data quality becomes an issue when we start looking at non-equity type assets and getting better management information. But we also come into looking at I guess two other groups of metrics, I would say. So one would be what I would describe as alignment metrics. I think Rachel pointed out, well, that we want to be on a journey to net zero by 2040, for example, and be aligned with a 1.5 degree pathway. So looking at measurements of the portfolio that give us some idea of how close we are to that trajectory or otherwise will be quite helpful. So things like, what percentage of organizations are we invested in that have formal verified science-based targets would be one measure. What percentage of assets we have invested in climate solutions is something that's suggested by the IIGCC framework as well. And again, you could regard that as something as more of an alignment metric. To pick up on the other point that's then been raised around, I guess, what more we can do, and particularly with the BlackRock point that was just made. I guess you can then look at things and say, well, can we set ourselves some stewardship or engagement type goals and look at what is being done in our name by those we're delegating responsibility to. So how many climate related engagements have managers had, how many significant climate votes have been voted in favour, and that gives us management information that allows us to challenge those who are acting on our behalf and say, well, look, if you haven't done that, why not? Why are you not holding them to account if we think it's sensible? But I think, as has been pointed out, all these things sit within the broader framework of different aspects of the strategy that we can look at and can monitor through time.
That's helpful. Thank you, Simon.
And all that comes back to you.
Yeah. Okay, so all that comes back in June. Are we going to get a presentation from True Costs in June as well? Are we planning to do that?
If there's appetite to do that, it's something we can look at. Yeah.
I think might be helpful to finally sign that off. Okay. So just say, I mean, we looked at as we set out there, looking at net zero by 2040, and is that an ambitious enough target? I know because the metric. I think I sort of get the metric. The metrics are going to confuse people, aren't they? Because some people say, "Oh, well, you're 96% divested already." I know it's going to be said, that's not what we're saying. You know what I mean?
No, they are quite different metrics. So the single target we chose previously really focuses on do we own companies that have substantial carbon reserves? So when you look at a 96% reduction there, what it's reflecting is that we have substantially reduced our ownership of oil and gas companies, of coal miners, and of general miners, because those are the companies that tend to hold those assets. So what we consider ourselves to have done is to have reduced our stranded assets risk. So reduce the risk.
Which is where we started.
We are invested in companies that may have essentially redundant assets on their books.
If I can just interrupt there, Jan.
And that's
just address Jonathan, because if you remember, the whole thing was designed to address the financial risks of the fund, and that's why we do it, and that's why we focus on stranded assets. So, okay, sorry.
Yeah,
I just thought
that was the focus at the time. Whereas as Simon sort of said, the alignment metrics actually they can look very different, because what some of those alignment metrics are looking at. So take for example the Paris alignment one, where you're looking at what proportion of the companies in your portfolio have a realistic plan for alignment, and that won't just apply to, say, oil and gas companies. That applies to, I don't know, consumer companies. It applies to hotels. So it's essentially they're a very different set of metrics. We've focused in on one, and I think really reduced those risks. But I think now it's about saying, okay, there's an awful lot more data available to us, and actually we can now look more broadly. And actually, there are some areas of the portfolio where naturally we won't look as good, but by measuring them, you can then actually start to put pressure on managers and put pressure on investee companies to say, okay, you know, and if enough people are doing that, you could have said, well, this is not sufficient. And that's how you know, the idea behind an awful lot of these is to really start driving that change. You know, if you look across financial markets as a whole, the idea that asset owners should do this is to try to drive change at the company level, so that, you know, if enough of their shareholders are saying to them, you really, you know, we are measuring you on this and you really ought to do it, then they should.
That's helpful. Henry? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Well, Henry, sure, and then if you raise the point, you might be able to help answer it as well. Go. So, Henry.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just thinking, should we perhaps start again? It seems to me that we set ourselves a target of 50% by now. We achieved 97%, which is incredibly impressive. But as Rachel said, the metrics have now changed. Can we go back 6 years now with the benefit of updated types of metrics? Go back to 2016 and then actually work out where we stand now on a new set of metrics which we want to adopt for the future, and then actually set ourselves a target for those which would allow us to instruct or recommend to our managers where they should be going for the next 15 years or something. But it seems to me that you know, if the metrics and the abilities of measurement have got better, which they must have done, we need to start somewhere. So I guess I'm being a bit long-winded here, but you know, we've achieved more than what was hoped for, but actually we now know a lot more. So should we start again now and set ourselves a new target on where we are now with the benefit of those improved metrics, and set ourselves a figure for the next, say, 10 years? I don't know. I don't know if that sounds sensible or not.
That's interesting. I mean, the problem I got is a presentational one. It's, I mean, I know we've just had an explanation from Rachel about how the metrics works, but what I know is going to be said, you know, from you know, for everybody is that okay, well, if you've got, you know, you've reduced your exposure to future CO2 emissions by 97% now, why is it going to take you another 20 years to get the other 3%? It's basically what I've got to explain to people somehow. I'm still struggling with it, I'm afraid. Anyway.
No, I do get that, Rob, but it seems to me that you know,
I get that. So to your point, might help with that.
Yeah, but we're not just about presentation here. I get the point of presentation. True. You know, we've got to 97% rather than 50%. But actually, we've now learned, the whole world has learned a whole lot more in the last 6 years. So perhaps we shouldn't just accept that fact and start again on the basis of increased knowledge, but bank essentially the fact that as far as the outside world is concerned, Hackney has achieved almost double what it wanted to do over the last 6 years, but actually now is going to set itself a new set of targets on the basis of increased knowledge. It seems to me that would be a totally right way to explain where we're going for the next 10 years.
Right. Okay. Karen.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's actually going back to your question, Chair, about is 2040 ambitious enough? I'm just highlighting I'm not at all an expert in this area, but with a governance hat on, I am very much aware of what other authorities are aspiring to do, and particularly the difference between what a pension scheme can aspire to do versus a company or an organisation. And I'm just wondering whether that point isn't clear enough, and whether maybe Simon or Andrew should just make sure that's clear enough, because from what I'm seeing, a lot of the other LGPS funds are actually going 2045 or 2050. And it's important as committee members that if you get challenged on why aren't you doing it sooner than 2040, that you are able to respond to that point and recognise the difference between you and your role as pension scheme trustees, which have less control over this compared to an organisation or a council. So I just wanted to make sure that point's covered.
Yeah, because I think
zero is a bit defined anyway. Simon wants to come in. Should we hear from Simon and then pick up Simon?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I think a couple of things to say on the date. So I think, as I've said before, you know, setting a date 20 years into the future, or 30 years into the future, when we're saying 2040, 2050 is a statement of ambition rather than a firm target. We don't know what the shape of the world is going to look like 20 years from now, but what it's doing is it's setting us on in a clear direction and saying we need to move at a certain speed. So clearly 2040 requires us to move faster than 2050. That has a bearing on interim targets that we might set. So when we think, if we say 2040, we need to move more quickly, which says, well, you know, if we have a target, say by 2030, we want to do something, that will require us to take far more action than if we set a goal of 2050. So the date matters because it reflects then in the speed. I guess I wouldn't look too hard at what other pension funds are doing. I think it's dictated by what you feel you can sensibly achieve. But I guess I would caution about setting too early a date, because one can only move at the speed that other investable companies or entities within the economy are moving. And I guess, you know, if you were to set a, you know, you can set a date of 2030, for example. If companies are not moving at that speed, say net zero by 2030, your portfolio is going to end up being very skewed to those companies who are, you know, low emitting and have moved quickly, rather than reflecting the sort of underlying movements that are going on in the real economy. And I think the date has to be set with recognition that it's the change in the real economy that is what matters most, because even if we achieve a net zero portfolio and the world hasn't moved at the same speed as we have, we are still subject to the risks of climate change. We may be subject to slightly less financial risk, but those other climate risks haven't gone away, and I think that's a really important point to bear in mind.
Okay, right.
Well, can I just add, I mean, that is undoubtedly true. The worry is that argument very quickly leads to not taking a position that is, as it were, a leading position, without being adventurous in the sense of pushing things too far, and the point that you've just made. But if you simply go with the natural, what you've called sort of industry average, then you're not actually playing the positive role that we have played, I think, in the last 10 years. And it would be, so I think this is a real judgment between leadership and reality, isn't it? And it's a tricky one. The other question I just wanted to be clear about, we are surely now not just talking, as you say, about the narrow band of mining, coal producing. We're now talking about how the overall portfolio is complying with that, which is a much more complex issue to oversee and manage. And I just want to be clear that we really are able to properly run the rule over the whole of our portfolio around this criteria that you talked about earlier.
So, I mean, in terms of sort of, what do you mean precisely by run the rule over the portfolio?
Well, you need to know how each of them performs around the dimensions that you talked about.
Yes, so obviously with any factor of this nature, it is, you know, one of the risks associated with it, and I think I've touched on it a little bit in the paper, is you are dependent on disclosure. So the metric that we've used for the previous target was dependent on disclosure of reserves by the underlying companies, just as the newer alignment metrics are. So, you know, the data is as good as what the underlying investing companies actually produce. And it's, you know, in terms of what's in the portfolio, yes, that, you know, it is a, you know, within a well-diversified portfolio, there will be companies there who are not as ready for transition as you would like them to be, and you know that is inevitable. And I think that's sort of, I think Simon drew that out quite well. It's one of the differences between moving to a wider, you know, setting a single target and moving to a wider sort of matrix of measures, is that the single target we set, we had quite limited information available, and what we chose to do was focus on the metric that we felt best reflected the financial risk to the fund. So it really, as a target, it really had, actually relatively little to do with an awful lot of the investee companies in the portfolio who didn't hold any reserves. What we're looking at now, and what, where the guidance for asset owners is heading, is that asset owners need to be aware, across their whole portfolio, of how ready for transition are their investee companies, and to put pressure on through engagement. And it's that is increasingly the direction of travel. It is inevitable, and it will happen for all funds. Even if you are even if you're an absolute leader in terms, in terms of sort of addressing your carbon risk, that there will be companies there who are, who aren't as ready you would like, who are not, strictly speaking, compliant. And the drive now is the pressure now on asset owners is very much to engage with that, to work collaboratively, and to open dialogues with fund managers and with investee companies to say this,
And presumably you're making judgments about their plans as much as their backward-looking achievements.
Yeah, so no,
that's a tough one.
That is exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we're going to go back to this much more detail. This is an initial report with the initial result of our 6-year strategy, which actually finishes technically in June. So we can pick up all the detail there. So, I mean, on the assumption we're moving forward on the basis of the first 3 bullet points there, can we just briefly just catch up on what's the rest of the responsible investment policy that we need to agree tonight?
Yes. So, responsible investment policy.
Also, Simon, before that, Simon wants to come back in again.
Just a very couple of very quick points, Chair.
Sorry.
So one about ambition. I'm absolutely not in any way suggesting we're not ambitious, and if we set a goal of 2040, that is ahead of every other country that's made a net zero commitment. I guess my point was one of avoiding unintended consequences, in that trying to move too quickly, you want your actions to be encouraging others to change. If your target forces you to divest from something because they are not moving as quickly as you want, that is an unintended consequence that we want to be aware of, and we want to just want to avoid. So is the point I would make. So we'll have more discussion on this, I'm sure.
Okay, yeah, because the ambition, basically the next stage is to play our part in changing the behaviour of the companies, not just about plugging assets that we don't want, isn't it, really? Okay, Rachel.
Yes.
Plugging assets we don't want is a technical term, by the way.
I think the point is that it can't be applied. It can't be applied to the entire of the portfolio. There will always be, sort of companies that aren't moving as quickly as you'd like. And I think I think what Simon's saying is, if you apply too strict a filter to that, your investable universe becomes incredibly small.
So can we move on to the last bit, the responsible investment policy?
Yes. So the responsible investment policy. This is so. This draft policy represents just an update to what we discussed at the previous workshop. So what we've tried to do is sort of distill it down a bit. So instead of having, I think it was eight or 9 priorities, I think we now have 3. We now have 3 key themes in there, which does sort of rationalise things a bit and make it a little bit more user friendly. And then obviously it's what it looks to do is to sort of set out a sort of a kind of governance structure for how we implement a responsible investment policy. Who is responsible for doing what the expectations are for strategy implementation, and then what sort of how we're trying to develop our approach to stewardship. So looking in particular, I think, at trying to put things in place that we can use to help essentially put together a really robust stewardship code application as well. So it's really looking at sort of putting processes in place for a responsible investment working group. Trying to get that flexibility so that we've got some member involvement in engaging with managers, but that we still have really regular meetings in place, because obviously we recognise it's very, very hard to do that with the full pensions committee, and lining up everybody's schedules. So there's not a huge amount of change, but as I said, it's distilling down those eight or nine priorities into 3 themes, and then just setting out a little bit of additional wording around sort of around our approach to exclusion. So really very much just stating that at present we don't see blanket exclusions as appropriate. But as you can see from some of the strategy decisions we've made, as a fund, we have not shied away from asking managers to implement reduced carbon strategies where that's appropriate. So it's sort of distinguishing between blanket exclusion and reduction where we feel it's appropriate.
Okay, it's brilliant. I thought that was late, but I thought it's really helpful and a simple statement of what we're doing. I think obviously in terms of the principles, the priorities you recommended adopting here, they focus very much on our climate ambitions, and also the investing on the human condition, I think, wraps up the issues that we discussed when all that time back, some of us discussed anyway, when we had the workshop with Karen Shackleton, and also the new focus we've had on human rights issues, which have, over the last couple of weeks, have just shown.
Yeah, can I ask about that? Yeah, Chair, about what is our exposure to Russian investment?
Yeah, should we pick that up when we do the either the quarterly report, or is that a good time to have that discussion?
Yeah. But I guess just to raise it, that is a relevant issue.
Yeah, certainly can ask that question. I mean, certainly relevant to this.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think if we can.
Yeah, sure. As long as it's covered.
Yeah, it will be.
But yeah, I thought it was very good.
Yeah,
clear statement.
and also we've got in here the beginnings of a more sophisticated approach to engagement. Okay, so any comments or questions on it? Don't see any hands. Oh, Robbie's battery's about to go. Yeah, so Karen.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Apologies, I just had a chance to speak to Rachel about this just before the meeting. There's probably just a couple of circumstances in the draft policy where the word committee perhaps should be fund or administering authority. So if the committee, please, I can pick up with Rachel and make some suggestions.
Thank you. Yeah, good. That's good. Good governance check on it. That'd be good. Okay. The other part I was just going to say, I mean, I've raised previously about collaboration in terms of maybe join up with a few organisations involved in this field. Like I've suggested IIGC and PRI, whether we should actually get involved with some positive collaborations like that. Could we pick that up in June maybe, or whenever?
Certainly, I think sort of in terms of sort of prioritising, I think our initial priority is certainly going to be the stewardship code. That's the submitting a really robust submission for the new stewardship code is probably our top one, and then obviously we can move on to look at some of the ones.
I don't see a reason to delay it though, if we're going to do it. That's the point I was going to make, I think. Okay, and then you need separately to think about resourcing all this, which I know that discussion. I won't raise that one now. Okay, yeah, any other last questions or comments on that? Are we happy to agree with the recommendation?
So
Sorry.
just absolutely clear that, you know, without going into the whole Russian exposure issue, but that kind of issue would fall within this this code, this
Yes,
framework.
I think
Yeah,
it
I think
does.
that's all I want.
No, exactly right. I just say to the whole Russian, it's just a huge and dramatic illustration of why human rights issues are investment issues.
Yeah. And that's properly
I mean,
covered in
you know, I
this
can't
code,
obviously do justice to the terrible events there, but you know.
I think this sort of what's set out in the policy, I think has actually been useful in terms of thinking about the approach to the Russian issue.
So we can draw on this to apply to them. That was all I was going
That's a good point, thank you. Okay, are we happy then to agree the recommendations set out? Thank you all very much indeed. Right, so now on, and then maybe see how fast we get on, have a break at some point. So, risk policy. Right. So, yeah, Rachel, you do.
Yep. So this is the pension fund risk policy. So this is one of our policies that we run for triennial review. So it was last reviewed in December of 2018. So it's been brought back to policy, largely because it's hit its 3-year threshold and is due for review. There are some minor changes to sort of our risk management process that the policy sets out, and then the report also sets out a little bit of detail about the risk register, and presents the most recently updated version of the fund's risk register. So it's really very much sort of, I can summarise quickly on the changes.
I don't think you need to do that because you really helpfully set that out as changes in the document itself. So that's a really good thing to do, by the way. That made it really clear. So can I just take this in 2 bits then, just to say, any questions on the risk policy before we look at the risks? Any policy on the risk policy? Questions on the risk policy itself, Michael?
We've entered a new era with what's happened in Russia and the huge inflationary impact on the British and other economies. The pound to the ruble is it's doubled. Not that we have that many investments in Russia. The pound to the dollar is about $1.31, which is lower than it was. The euro is about 1.19. Now, we did discuss hedging with currency risks, but if inflation is going to go up to 10%, as seems likely, I'm concerned about the risk that gives to us. So what can we or should we do about that?
Wow, right. We could deal with that now or under the investment report, couldn't we really? We'll deal with it now because the question's asked now.
Yep, I mean, sort of, I can pick up briefly, and I think Michael, if you don't mind, can also touch on it a little bit. So I know I think at some point during the committees last year, there has been discussion of currency hedging. The position that we're in as a fund is that our view is that in the longer term, a degree of currency hedging is likely to be appropriate for the fund. Obviously, it does not, as you might expect, it does not always work. It does not always work in our favour. But we do have some very, very long duration liabilities. So essentially, what we're trying to achieve is essentially agreement on a hedging strategy, that where we do not think that we as a fund are in a position to run a dynamic hedging strategy. We do not think we are in the position to be, frequently changing our hedging approach in response to global events. This is the challenge. Essentially, we have a large and diversified portfolio on which all of our investments are pooled. Some of our investments we receive information on, particularly those in private markets. We receive information on really quite slow timescales. Like many pension funds, compared to other actors in the financial markets, we recognise that we are slow moving. And so one consequence of that is that we are very rarely going to be in a position to make quick decisions about our currency hedging. So essentially, the view that we have taken and agreed upon is that a degree of currency hedging is appropriate. I think there are conversations underway about, as we've had a significant strategy change, we do actually now need to change how we implement our currency hedging policy. Thanks to our asset pooling has created difficulties for quite a few funds in terms of implementation, and that's something that we are going to be working on over the next few months. Obviously, we will of course look at questions of currency hedging when we review the strategy post-actuarial valuation. But again, it is something that we will tend to review in a long-term strategic sense. We will come around to it at least once every 3 years, but we are not in a position to make sort of dynamic decisions about it.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. This is a risk management. I can't get the red light to work. There we are.
It's because Rachel's is on.
Oh, that's all right. Well, I think you can hear me. No, I think that's very apt. But a snail may move very slowly, but it does move, and if you want it to turn around, it's quite difficult. I think over the last 7 or 8 years, our investments have diversified, so they're much more international than they were several years ago. So could you indicate the currencies that we are currently investing in terms of the assets we have? For example, the American investment obviously is in dollars. Have we got a great deal of exposure to many other currencies?
I have to admit, I will have to come back to you I'll have to come back to you with the split of exposures to currencies, but I can do.
All right, that's very helpful. It's not urgent.
It's probably worth updating the committee on where we are with that. Because
I could quickly update on that.
yeah, because we adopted a specific hedging strategy, didn't we? But there was some difficulty in executing it. So just update us where we are, which is to.
Yeah. So committee agreed to hedge at 30% of the fund, which was at the time that was agreed. That was roughly the level of hedging that the fund had through its current portfolios. Because of all the switches in portfolios, the mandates that we now have do not have hedging within them. So the committee agreed that 30%. We've got the recommendation. Hyman's did some work on our behalf with some hedging. What's the word I'm looking for? Hedging suppliers, I suppose.
Yeah.
And currently in the process of getting a report through the procurement process.
Yeah.
It doesn't require a full procurement because the level of fees is below the required level. So it'd be an officer, a delegated officer decision, which would just implement the remainder of that investment strategy. I'm just finishing that report off actually, so it should be, by the time we get the June committee, that should be in place, and we'll update accordingly.
Okay, and if we could have a note at some point, just setting out what our exposure is, as Michael's asked for, that'd be helpful. Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Of course.
Michael just kind of made mention of the rise in inflation. Would it be possible to, kind of touch on the positive impact on the funds?
Of the
the rising inflation, that inflation is bound to go up, and what will be the likely impact on the funds?
Does, Dan, I can't see hands anymore, I'm afraid. There's loads of them, look at them. Right, we're wandering well off risk here at the moment, but anyway, Andrew, and then
Jonathan.
Andrew first, I'll work out who else wants to speak as well. Yeah, Andrew, then Jonathan.
Maybe just to chip in a little bit on the currency piece, but then also come back to the inflation point as well. So on the currency side of things, as Michael said, the low carbon and the sustainable equity funds are unhedged. The BlackRock World Equity Fund is a hedged portfolio, but the intention is to sort of evolve into the sort of circa 30-odd% hedged to overseas assets as been agreed from a strategic perspective. The majority, in relation to your point, Michael, the majority of overseas exposures are dollar and euro, and they would be very much the predominant. There are peripheral exposures to other currencies, but those would typically be perhaps slightly uneconomical to go through a hedging process to actually mitigate against, and given the sort of pros and cons of currency, we would continue to support focusing on the two biggest exposures, which would be dollars and euro, and we'll come back to specifics on that in terms of in future discussions. In relation to the question on inflation, I think in terms of explicit inflation hedging protection from the asset portfolio, from, let's say, short-term perspective, the assets have got modest exposure or modest explicit hedging to inflation. But I think, given we're a very long-term fund, given that the nature of the liabilities are very long-term, given some of the inflation pressure that we're seeing at the moment is short-term, and over the longer term, we would expect that to normalise back to what the central government policy is across the globe as well, not just in the UK. And unless that changes, we would expect that to be the case. I would additionally add that many of the asset classes that the fund has got exposure to, equities being a very good example, where we've got a circa 50%, they would be over the short term not something which you might expect to think about in terms of what their inflation protection is. But actually, over the very long term, they've got really good inflation hedging characteristics, if you like, because they do shelter you from some of those inflation exposures. So actually, given we're a long-term investor, given we're looking at some of these assets to be held over a very long term, the inflation of a lot of the asset classes that the fund has exposure to are really, really positive, in my opinion.
Thank you. Yeah. Jonathan and then Henry. Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Andrew. Excellent comment about the inflationary protection that we've got within the overall portfolio. Over 50% equities at the moment. Don't forget property. Real assets benefit from a little bit of inflation in the economy. Thanks.
Thank you. Henry?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what Andrew said, I'm going to stick my neck out here. I think currency hedging is a short-term tactical device. It's fine for very specific currencies, but this is a long-term pension fund with long-term actually liabilities. If we get our investment strategy right across an international portfolio, I just think hedging is a monkey's game, quite honestly. I wouldn't know where to start, and I'm not saying I'm a hedging expert, but if we get our investment strategy right, the funds right across a mixture of dollar, international, euro-related funds in equities, why spend more money on a hedging strategy, which is, I have to say, adds absolutely nothing other than complexity and cost. So, but I've said that before.
Yeah, and that's where we ended up with our current strategy, isn't it? As a reduction. Okay. Are there any other questions on the risk report? The risks themselves, there's nothing really that I was surprised about. Obviously concerned particularly on the Reliance External Systems issue. I could see its impact. We've discussed that today, but likely.
Sorry, Chair, can you point us to what?
Sorry, on page 30, the sixth, number 6. Reliance External Systems. Compromise, the cyber attack basically, isn't it?
Is that effectively where we are in terms of the implementation of the cyber strategy?
Yeah,
Yeah.
if I may, Chair, I think it's because we're in the early stages of
Right.
the cyber strategy and actually doing the investigations, and hopefully that can reduce quite quickly in the next few
I
months.
think that's fair enough. I mean, it's very serious. We understand that. We discussed that earlier, didn't we? Okay. Has anybody else got any questions or comments on that? In that case, then, can we please approve the updated risk policy and note the register?
Agreed and noted.
Thank you. I'm not sure what to do about the procurement thing. I mean, presumably, if we do that now, we ought to ask all our advisors to leave or turn off and then come back. Is that, or should we? I'm looking at the officers. We should do that.
Relatively easy.
We can pick
Is that all right? I mean, I don't know.
Andrew,
How are we going to contact people online when we're finished? Okay.
Andrew, is that all right?
Yeah, I was going to say,
Andrew,
I think what happens, what we'll do is we'll dial out and maybe we'll dial back in and say 5 minutes. But what happens is whenever we dial back in, we're held in the waiting room. Until
That's I've forgotten that. So no, just dial back in and then Rabbit will talk to you there.
Well, any of you who are logged in can let them back in, can't you?
Rabbit can let them back in.
Rabbit's gone out battery.
Well, I'm sure we can deal with it.
Oh,
Separately,
well,
we come to it.
we'll see what happens. Go on then. So, okay. So, right, this is about reprocurement of the.
Yes. So this is we've got a series of contracts that, thanks to COVID-19, our procurement schedule got absolutely blown out of the water. So we've got a series of contracts that had some very awkward expiry dates that we now have needed a plan to retender these. So what you're asked to do is to essentially approve reprocurement with no competitive tender on actuarial services and the benefits and governance contract. So the reason for doing this is we are in the middle of the actuarial valuation and consider that the risk of having to change actuary is not acceptable. It would significantly disrupt one of the fund's most important activities, and it simply isn't the right time to do it. So normally we would reprocure in a non-valuation year, but thanks to the pandemic, that's been delayed, and we are where we are. Benefits and governance. The reason that is also you're also asked to put that out for another year is simply that it's part of it is let off the same framework as the actuarial contract. Letting it off the same framework means there is a certain desire to keep dates of the contracts aligned so that we don't get into trouble with frameworks ending and contracts needing retendered. It also saves us a bit of work on the procurement because we can run it essentially as a single procurement with 2 competitions running simultaneously. So it's a lot more efficient in terms of both officer and committee time, which is just do it once. The consequence is, because we let this under a framework that's now expired, we are in a bit of a difficult situation. So what we've proposed is direct call off under a new framework, which is permitted under the lot we've suggested. So what we'd be doing is essentially letting the contract as a project that encompasses all of the work that they currently do. It is, obviously, in an ideal world, we would have relet this a couple of years ago, but that's just not been possible thanks to the pandemic. So we really just need essentially to have a solution that puts a legal contract in place for a year while we wait for the valuation to be completed. And you will note that once that's done, we've asked to agree to put these out for competitive tender again in 2023.
So it's for 1 year.
1 year, yeah, which is, so the last date we can sign off the valuation is the 31st of March 2023. If we achieve it earlier, then obviously we can start earlier. But it seems sensible to give us the time frame for the valuation before we start. The other two recommendations are for approval of the extension of the investment consultancy contract till 30th of September 2022, which is simply to allow time for procurement, and just to note the position on the custodial services contract, which is a procurement that's carried out by officers. The others all involve a scored interview scored and pensions committee.
Okay, seems all right. So can you just, could
Oh,
I?
it's just Andrew wanting to rejoin.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can we just the timelines for each of them, just quickly? So the actuarial service contract, you're saying you're going to relet that under those arrangements?
Yes, so what we're going to relet for 1 year.
1 year, okay.
Along with the benefits and governance contract. That will see us through to the end of the valuation. There is a new actuarial benefits and governance services framework in place, and so we will run the procurement through that.
So the admin one, and they'll both be extended for 1 year, and we'll end up reprocuring them properly in spring 23.
Spring summer next year. Yeah.
And but the investment consultancy one.
Is to be done this summer.
To be done this summer.
So
okay.
the reason for the timeline on that one.
Now we're right there because
it is 1 year. When you say spring, summer, I'm beginning, because when does the, because any procurement needs an exact date.
Yeah.
For when it's we're reprocuring it from and when it will go to. So there must be a definite date.
Yeah. So what we've asked for is essentially alignment with committee dates. So we will be looking. So for the direct call off, we will look to let the contract until 30th of June. With the expectation that we will be that the final sign off on that will be at the June committee, and for investment consultancy we've gone for September 2022 with expected sign off in that September at the September meeting.
So it's more than a year, it's 15 months.
Yeah, it's 15 months as well.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely, the dates.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get to.
Okay, so we will reprocure. We will go through a process to investment consultants sometime after, when? Because before September 22.
Before September. So the reason.
And then the other ones will be before
June 2023.
Okay. Oh, at the moment, our actuarial services contract is with the same people, well, same firm, not the same people, obviously, as the investment consultancy. Is
Yes,
that a problem?
two separate contracts though.
Yeah, but I mean, that's not really what I was asking.
No, I don't see it as. They are separate divisions in the same. They are separate divisions in the same company.
Yeah,
I don't see it as a.
And the other point I've just made to our colleagues is that I've emphasised that particular previous experiences that it's really important that we are given as a committee a real choice when it comes to making particularly the investment consultancy contract. And I think it's not the appropriate time to discuss the merits of particular firms, but I mean I think it's important we have a rigorous process and a real choice in that particularly, which we should have an important part in. So we should not be a rubber stamp, particularly on that one.
So it means that we do have some initial input to it before June of 23.
There's going to be separate
Scored interviews.
What you will
I
have.
say that as we inadvertently sorry, I'm not really good tonight. We inadvertently into a situation where because we didn't pay enough attention to the process earlier on as a committee, we ended up actually being, having very little discretion at the end of it. So we just.
Can I ask a couple of questions here? I am happy with the extension. I think that makes sense. We don't want to be caught with our pants down in a situation where we have to do statutory things and we're not in a position to fulfil them. How long, I think I was around, well, certainly alive. How long was the Hyman's contract originally? How long were they?
Which one?
Pardon?
Which one? Because there's two.
The consultancy one.
So the consultancy contract that's been in place for several years with essentially periodic renewal.
Because I think I was originally involved.
Yeah, no, you would.
A long time ago.
So it's several years. The other question I have, and I'm reasonably happy with the standard we get. But why is it we don't have this in-house? We have a huge estate of offices here which are being underused. We spent a fortune on the service centre. Large numbers of people are working at home. So there are huge economies of scale by having our own officers in-house to do these particular jobs. Why don't we do that?
So interestingly, so there are so we are in the grand scheme of things a relatively small fund. It is financially more effective for us to use. And more effective for us to use an investment consultancy service. There is also the question of the LGPS of the LGPS regs that do direct you to seek advice. And obviously there is the question of regulation. So we as officers are not regulated, whereas Hymans Robertson are. So.
You're regulated by us.
No, we are not regulated
No,
officially
I
by
know.
the FCA, and that's the material point
Right.
here. But essentially, seeking advice from an investment consultant with FCA, who is regulated by the FCA, essentially guarantees that you've met that statutory provision in the LGPS regs. So. And
is it the case with other leading London local authorities that this is the case?
Yes, they all use
using external.
You won't. I don't think you'll find any that don't.
It's a good question to ask when the Equinity one comes up next time.
Well, as I say, as a council, because of our political ideology, which I think is evident on this side of the table, we want as much in-house as possible. We probably know that we're bringing in-house traffic wardens and such like. But I think
at the end of this month.
There are specific issues which you've said, which I probably raised several years ago, but I've forgotten what the answer was, which make that sensible in terms of regulation.
It's largely it is financially more efficient. So one of the difficulties with running a pension fund is that it covers an absolutely huge range of things. So whilst both Michael and I are qualified accountants, there are plenty of things that we are not in fact qualified to do. So virtually all pension funds, unless they are absolutely huge, will seek quite extensive specialist advice on a large number of topics. So we take advice from a huge number of suppliers. So one good example is that over the last couple of weeks, we have sought specialist legal advice on a benefits issue, and it's one, obviously the council has a very good in-house legal department. But it's a very niche piece of legislation, and we don't, we do not expect the council's lawyers to go out and suddenly train themselves on this.
Finally, I've never actually asked, how many do we have in our own pensions department working directly?
Working directly, we have an administration team of 5. We have an investment and accounting team of 4, and then obviously we draw quite heavily on other services within the council.
Sure.
So part of Jackie's time is given to the pension fund, part of Ian's time we draw on legal. We obviously draw on legal services. So yeah, we make use of that. A lot of other services in the council.
Right.
Okay. Yes. Okay. And I said it's a good question though, especially when we look toward the more task-oriented bits of the thing. Okay, can we agree the recommendations set out? Okay, and if we can now have a 5-minute break? Yeah. Oh, sorry, Henry, my apologies. And someone else has got their hand up, but I can't see who it is. I just see the hand, that's Jonathan, isn't it? Henry, then.
Yes, sorry.
Don't just love the technology. Henry, then Jonathan, I apologise.
Sorry, very quickly, I got no problem with the recommendations, but I do think the two most important sets of advice here are the investment consultant and the actuaries. And I think it's important that they are independent and therefore external. So I would completely support the retention of them as external advisors. But I think in terms of future procurement, it does seem to make sense to review the actuary after the appropriate triennial valuation, I don't know, 6 months afterwards, but not to get that reappointment or appointment too closely interlinked with the appointment of the investment consultant. So it does seem to be that in future we should try and get an 18-month gap in between appointment of an actuary and a subsequent appointment of an investment consultant, so that there's some sort of rota there. And if they do involve a panel, that therefore the panel doesn't get everything rolled up at the same time, which is quite important. So I would advocate getting some sort of rota put in place so that you can take the external actuaries 1 year, the investment consultant 18 months later, and then you follow on with the actuary again 18 months later after that, after the next valuation, and so on. It seems to be more logical.
So by and large, Henry.
Should we take
oh, sorry. This is
Jonathan, and then perhaps then you come back and just answer them all at once. Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair. My issue is that we have an admin team of 5. We have an accounting team of 4. We also make use of Key Moyle services, part-time, I guess, but it's probably a reasonable fraction of her time. All this is going to be borne by the pension fund, I suspect. Please confirm.
Yes, logically. So that's Jonathan. That is a requirement.
The answer is yes. Could you ask your question, please, Jonathan? Sorry, be here all night otherwise. Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair. I thought it was a question.
Well, the answer is yes then. Comment. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So yeah, I think Henry's point's useful. I'll ask the officers to think about timing of that and go forward. I mean, we've got process now. So yeah. Can we then agree the recommendations?
Agreed.
Okay, thank you all very much. If we can have a 5-minute gap now to refresh. Yeah. Tell them to go. I just noticed we're still on the live stream. So even though we're through that with the live stream, so.
Good point.
Are you all back in, ready to, Andrew, hi, welcome back. We ready to kick off again?
Yeah, people speculate. It's said it's around. Which is
All right, pensions admin strategy. There's, I think it's fairly straightforward, and as far as I could see, not a lot had changed.
That is exactly as per the last meeting. We consulted on it, nobody responded, so the recommendation is to approve it based on what you agreed at the last meeting.
Yeah.
In a nutshell.
Okay, is there anything either of you wanted to add to the report? Okay, is there any questions from members or comments? Can we then agree the recommendations and agree the description? Thank you very much. Business plan, item 8. Again, I mean, it's a clear report. Have any of the officers anything to add to it?
Unless
No.
there's any questions.
All right, is there any questions from members?
The only comment I will make is just about the training for members.
Yes.
Because, from time to time, we just need some refreshment. Refreshing, sorry.
Yep.
There's a Freudian slip.
Yeah, coffee has gone.
I'm not hungry. So don't worry. I'm not hungry. So we need to refresh, because sometimes this change, there's a lot of change happening and everything. So people can get out of mind.
I think if there is committee appetite for a sort of general refreshing.
Yeah. Useful. If I may, Chair, can I just highlight that every year we bring the business plan to committee, and I think every year I say we're in unprecedented times, but actually, can I really just say the next 2-3 years are going to be really, really tough because of things like the Cloud Pensions Dashboard, all your RI work, and therefore I think the committee should recognise the strain this will have on officers and also your own business. So I think it's important we recognise it's a tough time.
I didn't comment on the risk thing and the regulatory risk, but I did notice that Theresa Clay, who some of you may is the senior pensions person in the government, civil servant, was at the Scheme Advisory Board committee I attend, and announced that she had 5 extra staff.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that means that we are in for some heavy regulations on all sorts of things that have been delayed for 18 months, 2 years, that are all going to come at once. And, yeah.
Well put, Chair.
So I sense that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
And in the risk register.
Yeah, and it's quantified.
Yeah. Well, we don't know what they're going to tell us to do yet, do we? That's the thing, but it's one sense is it's...
so we should know roughly though. Yeah.
If I may, Chair,
would you like to comment, Karen? Yeah, go on.
Within the business plan, we have noted a number of things we are expecting. What we don't know is necessarily the detail. For example, we are expecting some pooling guidance, consultation in the summertime. What may be in that, goodness knows. And we've got the Levelling Act,
I was just going to say,
and we've got TCFD, and we can guess some of that, but actually the true implications will be when they hit the table. So.
Yeah, there's reference to the LGPS in the Levelling Up guidance. It is name checked. The government has once again sort of come across the government's radar as a potential source of money, but obviously you can't say until they finally release some sort of consultation on it what the actual implications are.
And if I may, Chair, I think the key point is to recognise it's not just in one area. It's not just about investments. It's not just about administration. It's across the whole spectrum of the management of your fund.
Okay. Thank you.
Really clear presentation, actually. Isn't it?
Yeah, we can go through it all. The training point's very important, and obviously there are undoubtedly changes to committee at the beginning of the year, so obviously we need to do the general stuff as well. Okay, are there any other questions? Can we just ask to agree? Are we? Can we approve the business plan?
Agreed.
Okay. Quarterly update report. Okay, there's a lot in here. Do you want to say anything by way of introduction? This is the opportunity to ask about Russia and the position of the fund, really, isn't it? So, I mean,
I so ask.
Shall we just dive in and ask about obviously we've got a report of the fund here with figures as of December. Andrew's there. obviously there's some huge events in the world in the last few weeks which we've affected. So can someone give us a sort of update on the position?
In terms of,
Michael?
yeah, I'll pick up.
So that's the position. So that's the funding position.
Going off. So obviously this report, as you say, takes us up to the end of December in terms of performance, etc. So it doesn't pick up any impact from Russia, etc. Hyman, so Andrew has liaised with all the fund managers, the relevant fund managers over the last couple of weeks to analyse what our exposure is. As we thought it would be minimal. We've got 0.05% of the fund, so roughly £1 million is our exposure to Russian investment or Russian related investments at the moment. And obviously that's the current value. What it might have been back in when the invasion started, etc. It's probably slightly higher than that, but our overall actual investments in anything like that is 0.05%.
Can you just define that, Michael? What do you mean by a Russian investment? Is it wholly owned? Is it?
Well, we're not direct.
With
So we
people
don't
who've got
directly
substantial
own
shareholding.
anything. So the pension fund doesn't directly own any companies. It's all through the port investment.
No, I understand that, yeah.
So if one of the mandates has a Russian company in it, etc., or one of the banks maybe, then we will be exposed to that level of it.
Andrew might.
Sorry,
Sorry, Michael, have you finished it?
Yeah, I was just going to say, obviously, our position is that we're working with the fund managers to work through the actual position on it, and if we can divest of those, then over time, then we will. But it's not something we could do immediately, obviously, but we need to work with the fund managers to actually look at how that works with sanctions, etc.
Unpick that.
Yeah, I think-
Andrew.
Sure. So perhaps I'm happy to go into a bit more detail and colour in terms of sort of general investment.
I think that there's a great deal of interest in it in the committee, so feel free to.
But just to pick up first in relation to just to give a flavour of the assets. So, for example, within the Global Alpha Paris Aligned Fund, there are two holdings. One which is a Russian bank, which is London Stock Exchange listed. At its peak, it was around 0.3 of the portfolio, and it's now obviously fallen in value. But obviously, applying the proportion of the assets to that weighting within the fund is why we get to such a small number at the 0.05 level. And I should add that 0.05 covers both Russia and Ukraine, probably about half each. Maybe a couple of other assets as examples. There's a sort of legacy holding within some of the BlackRock pool funds of a UK listed Russian steel company. So those are a couple of examples of the assets which are in the portfolio. And I'll pause there, and maybe I don't know, Rachel or Michael, if there's anything else you want to say, and I'm happy then to go into before we take questions, perhaps to go into some of the broader considerations.
I mean, I suppose it's really just to sort of.
Jonathan, I'll just hear from the officers and then I'll take you. Yes, sorry.
Just to build on what Michael said around, because obviously Michael's brought up the issue of divestment, and I suppose essentially our viewpoint on it would be that it is our so. It's obviously, as Michael and Andrew have highlighted, it's a really limited exposure in terms of what we actually have in the fund. So it's concentrated in our equity portfolios. It's a very small number of stocks. It is our intention to divest from these when we can practically do so. So the issue obviously that we have at the moment, and this will apply, no matter what you hear from other LGPS funds. This applies to everybody. It is extremely difficult at the moment to sell those assets. It is simply not practically possible. So essentially, our viewpoint would be the intention is there. The intention is there to divest, and sort of the key reasoning behind that is, and I'm sure Andrew will want to elaborate as well. There's two key points. So the first one is that, you know, even though yes, there has already been a drop in value in these investments, you know, the viewpoint would still be that they present a long-term holding them presents a long-term financial risk. They are, you know, they are simply not investments that we want to hold in the longer term for financial reasons now. The other key points that are driving an intention to divest, which, you know, that's not a statement we've ever really made before, to say that yes, we actually specifically wish to exclude these particular stocks. And the reason we feel that it's so justifiable in this case is that it's really, really clear that there is no possibility of engagement in these cases. That, you know, usually we would look to engagement as a first line response, and it is not appropriate or practical here. You can't do it, and that's what sort of earmarks these as stocks that, you know, we are intending to divest from them. And we will do it as we will work with managers, and obviously we'll work with finance, we'll work with investment managers, and we'll work with the CIB, and those will be removed from the portfolio as soon as is feasible to do so.
Okay. So Jonathan's bursting to come in, and then.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. I think, as a long-term investor with a long-term horizon, we should, as a committee making decisions, be very wary of knee-jerk reactions. To say that we're going to divest from our Russian and Ukraine holdings is a pretty sweeping statement. They may be de minimis in terms of the overall portfolio and its exposure, but nonetheless, some of those investment holdings do have an asset value. I think we should be very careful about a knee-jerk divestment. Thanks.
Andrew. Sorry.
Yeah. Perhaps I'll touch on maybe an overview of sort of general investment considerations. Just to clarify one point there in terms of Jonathan's comment, though. What we sought to do was to ascertain the exposure to Russia and Ukraine. Very different, separate considerations whenever it comes to any consideration of divestment. And I would think that any consideration of divestment might focus on Russia rather than Ukraine. But from an understanding of the financial risk point of view, from an information consideration, that's why we sought to ascertain the exposure to both. And that's
sorry, Andrew. We should have clarified that point. That yes, it would relate only to the Russian assets rather than the Ukrainian ones.
And as everyone has very rightly said, and Chair, you set out, first and foremost, this is a human crisis, and it's just terrible, the events that are happening. But what we've sought to do here, and my comments, is to think about it from a general investment considerations perspective, from the strategic side of things, from the pension fund. So in general terms, as we've noted, the Russian exposure is a very small portion of assets. I think it's important to note, and this extends from some of the conversation or the points that Rachel made, the sanctions and the conflict both make this a financial risk. And we note that much of this financial risk has already materialised, in the sense that the assets have been written down in value. And therefore some of that financial risk has been played out, if you like. We have seen some clients who have chosen statements in relation to divestment. As Rachel said, I think we can support that in relation whenever it comes to considerations of the likelihood of effectiveness of any consideration of engagement. The fact that there are increased risks from an ongoing standpoint, the fact that we don't know what sort of time horizon we're looking at in relation to the extent of the situation and how long it may prevail, but very much something for the committee to consider. A couple of other investment points to note. Index providers, unanimously pretty much in terms of the main providers, both FTSE and MSCI, for equities and debt, have removed Russia from their universe. So that is therefore from let's say from the manager's point of view, that's a decision that they have taken out of your hands, and the intention is for them to be removed as part of the construction methodology of the index. There are practicalities in terms of how they can actually sell the exposures down within the funds they currently got, but for all intents and purposes, the index design of the index funds that you hold, Russia will be removed, and it will no longer be an asset that should be held within the funds when it is practical to do so. As Rachel said, in terms of the practicalities, trading has been suspended on Russian stocks in the Russian Stock Exchange. Trading has been suspended on Russian stocks listed on the London Stock Exchange. And if you're a debt holder, of which the fund holds none, zero, if you were a debt holder, then clearly you've lent the money to a business. You want to repay that. So in actual fact, the thinking from a debt investor perspective is slightly different, because you still want to get your money back at some stage. But in all those situations for Russian directly held assets, there are complications. But specifically in the equity assets, which the equity asset universe, if you like, which is relevant for the pension fund, there's very little that can be done at this stage, because the liquidity access has been removed from the possibility from either the manager selling the portfolio or the assets on your behalf. There's one other thing, maybe this is boilerplating perhaps, but from an investment considerations point of view, one consideration could be to get rid of, if you did choose to divest, for example, you could consider to sell down the holdings that you've got in terms of the pooled funds. We would not consider that to be a practical and sensible approach, given the transaction costs involved and the level of the exposure. So that's probably just a broad overview of investment considerations. So to my mind, areas for you to consider at this point, it's focusing on engagement with managers. So LSEV and BlackRock being the two who have, continuing to understand how they are taking decisions on your behalf moving forward, and to express your views and opinions. Consideration of beliefs and divestment, which I know is one of the subjects we're about to discuss. And those would be probably the two key areas that we would see as being the priorities from the current position of the fund.
Thank you, Nick. And then
I found
we'll come back to Jonathan.
Both Rachel and Andrew's contribution very helpful in terms of setting a clear reasoning why it was right to apply that. I think that's very helpful. What I'm still not following is what we're defining as a Russian asset. Is it a wholly owned, 100% owned company with Russian shareholders quoted on the Moscow Stock Exchange? And if so, what about assets or companies which have very substantial shareholders who are backed by Russian assets? Because those companies will also, well, there are a number of questions relating to the board members of those companies, many of them British owned, but they're backed by money and equity which is of dubious value. So I guess there's also a whole set of risks around not the wholly owned ones, but the ones where we have substantial holdings. So how are we approaching that issue?
Can we hold that and then just take Jonathan, and then officers and advisors can sum up perhaps. Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Andrew. Excellent commentary. Thank you, Councillor Nick Sharman. Very good points. Can I just say, in the question of the FTSE 100 listed companies, many of which are going to be demoted, but they're likely to go into the FTSE 250, they are subject to regulation by the Financial Conduct Authority. They have been the people who have decided to suspend trading in those shares. Also to mention that even BlackRock, despite its incredible research capability, was slow off the mark. It was buying Polymetal, a big Russian gold and precious metals miner. And it's basically said it got it wrong. It did it too late, but nonetheless, it has done it. And that's a black mark against BlackRock. This is the situation. You've got politicians reacting, you've got investment managers reacting, and there's always this time question. These things are very, very fast moving, and it's incredibly difficult. But this is where we have to stand up and take a long-term view.
Okay, Do we want to, if we can ask the officers to come back on all those points, including Nick's point? So who wants to come back first, Rachel?
Sorry, so, I was going to say,
Could I, sorry.
Yes,
sorry.
Andrew. Go on, Andrew. Yeah.
So just to specifically answer next question, the exposure we have stated in 0.05 represents Russian companies listed on either Russian stock exchange or Russian companies which have listed on other stock exchanges. It does not represent indirect exposures to which you relate, and that is something that we have asked questions of managers, and we have received some information, but I wouldn't be comfortable saying that I'm in a position at this stage to give a representative answer on that. But you're absolutely correct saying that it's a complicated area, and I think that there's a lot of cogs being turned at managers at the moment to try and come back with something that's probably not misleading. It's fair, and it's also not creating a sort of minefield, if you like. So there's a combination of things there, but definitively at this stage, it's Russian companies either in Russian stock exchange or other stock exchanges.
Did you?
yes, just to add to what Andrew said, and just to address your point a little bit, is that yes, so what, as Andrew said, what we've looked to do in the immediate term is to identify where we have holdings that are directly affected by sanctions. Obviously, in the slightly longer term, there is sort of over the next few weeks, it will be sensible to look at to try and have a look at some of our indirect exposure, and just take a view on what some of the financial risks there are. But no, what we've sought to do with this particular exercise is so that we could identify risks quickly is look at those companies that are directly affected.
That's reassuring. So by the next meeting, could we have a review of all those with a substantial investment?
I think depending on what you mean by substantial.
Yeah, I know. Well, you'll have to define that. Yeah, but I mean, you know what?
We need an update.
We need anything with more than 50% would be a first start. But I would say you probably need to go below the 30% mark.
There's definitely
Anywhere where you've got Russian exposure to their asset base that's driving a company.
So that's something that I think we can provide you with an update on.
Okay, could we? I mean, you said very clearly during the introduction about the suggested position on our Russian holdings, which was that we basically invest when we can. But if you could say precisely what it was, I don't want to put words in your mouth, so say precisely what it was you were.
That essentially it is our intention to divest from those Russian holdings as soon as it's practically feasible to do so, because
recognising all of the stuff we just talked about.
Because obviously, and the fact we do have the issue that trading is suspended. There is no real way to anybody saying they have done it.
Yeah. Like, and if I could add that, like, because we understand all other pension funds in this position.
So we are essentially we are certainly nothing out of the ordinary. Both in terms of the level of exposure we had and our response to it. This, we certainly don't look exceptional in any sense.
Okay. As a committee, are we happy with that approach?
That's fine. Yeah.
No. But could we add that the rider that by the next meeting this wider review would be?
We'll give you an update.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm noting Jonathan's point. So we'd be happy with that approach because it is our decision.
Yeah.
Okay. Can we, Rabia, can we make sure we've got a note of our position on that? Thank you very much for that advice. Okay, while we're on the investment bit then, can I ask about we were reporting a fantastic position of being 109% funded at the end of December, but I'm guessing that the wider, so it's on the, in the appendix, it's supplementary.
Supplementary.
Yeah.
You haven't got supplementary.
Oh, I haven't got
Yeah, it's on that. Yeah. You can take that. I've got to go to the top. Sorry.
Chair, I think Andrew.
I'm just saying, obviously the market's been in turmoil as a result of the bits we've just been discussing. Is it possible to give us any update on the position?
Certainly.
Currently.
To give a broad estimate, so as you say, there's been lots of impacts across the board in markets, both in the equity and fixed income space, and in some ways it's quite interesting to bear this in context of a very recent period of market stress, which was COVID, just around almost 2 years ago to the day. So I would estimate, broad brush, that the funding is probably 5-6% worse than what it is represented at year end. To put that in context, during COVID, funding went down by north of 15%. So without doubt, a deterioration in funding, but the volatility experienced has been less extreme than perhaps what we've seen in very recent history. So I think the important probably just point to note is that we would be coming to you with recommendations of any changes if there were any at this stage, but we are not recommending any changes to the investment strategy as a result of the deterioration in funding that was recently been experienced.
Thank you. I'm conscious that the actuarial evaluation will be based on the situation as at the 31st of this month, isn't it? I mean, I wonder if either the advisors or the officers have a comment on that and whether that puts us at a particular risk about the result of the actual evaluation, or is it something?
If I may,
Yes, of course.
just from a governance perspective, it is a snapshot in time. I suppose probably if the fund actually were here and recognising not at all naturally, I think the concern then is how that then drives into employer contribution rates, which will be part of a bigger discussion, but recognising that we've had situations of valuations in the past where I've seen the snapshot at the 31st of March, but then the valuation report tends to talk about what's happened after that point in time and have regard to that as well.
COVID crisis.
That's right, yeah.
I think we have to recognise that obviously the actuarial evaluation is based on thousands of scenarios, so it doesn't take account of this type of event happening. So yeah.
I think
it says here that since 31st of March 2019, there's been a 32.5% improvement, which is so good as to make me rather nervous.
It's just got.
I've always known I was a genius, but I didn't realise that.
As Andrew just said, it's gone down a bit.
I know it has gone down a bit, but we know that commercial property has been extremely volatile with all the problems of the pandemic. So what is driving this very significant and successful achievement?
It's the brilliant guidance.
Well, the committee.
I think what you meant to say, Councillor Desmond, was apart from the guidance.
It's genius. I mean, we've seen it improving, but is there any particular asset class that is enabling us to achieve these results?
Today, it's largely been the equities, which have continued to really perform very well, despite.
That's good news. Do you want this back?
No.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
There was a similar problem in 1929, of course.
Andrew, will you come in on that, Andrew? Sorry, I'm losing the plot here with the technology. Andrew.
I would say that the 10-second summary. The 10-second summary is strong growth, asset performance, predominantly equities, and yields have gone up a bit. So it kind of yields going up makes your liabilities a bit lower. Equities doing really well means your assets have done better than the returns your recovery plan expects over a short period of time. We know that the fund needs to think in a long-term perspective. We know that other valuations haven't seen such good periods, but the last 3, 6, 9 years has been excellent from a growth asset performance point of view. And probably the one difference in the last 3 years is the fact that yields have ticked up. So it's really good. You've got two driving factors: growth assets and a little bit of yields going up.
Thank you, Jonathan. Again, and then I think we'll move on.
Thank you, Chair. Can I quickly add that, the predominant stock market in the global economy is the United States. They are effectively insulated from what's happening on the continent of Europe. That's a major, major reason for the performance by stock markets. Are American stocks overvalued? That's a good question. But nonetheless, with technology and all those benefits, I'd say we'd stick with it. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, are there any other questions about investments? Is there anything else in the quarterly update report? I just wanted to note the admin performance seems a bit better, doesn't it? Necrotini seems much improved.
Yeah.
Is that because they're under less pressure now? Is it that they're beginning to work out their problems?
If I may, Chair,
Yeah, please.
finishing up, their case numbers are remaining quite high, but they're managing to actually control them better. The new contract manager that's come in seems a robust gentleman that is actually, when he says he's going to do something, he does tend to do it, and he's very honest and direct when he's not able to do something, which I think is actually very helpful. So yeah, things are pretty well. And probably the one other positive thing that I would highlight is the onboarding of the interface for Hackney Council data now feels like we're getting to the stage where we might start going live, which will have a fundamental positive impact on the data quality for the fund and their work involved in trying to get the data up to the right level. So once we get across that line, I think that should be celebrations all round. So yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, it's good to see anyway. See. And Rachel's made a difference in the 2 months.
What I was actually going to say about it.
Well done.
I've tried to change it.
How do your babies help to advise?
No, I would ask her about it. No, depressingly, I sort of thought, I in the year I was off, it seemed the progress on the internet seemed to improve radically. So.
Thank you very much. It's good to know the improvement. Anyway, has anyone else got any questions? In that case, can we note the report? Okay then, so if I have to read this out, don't I? Can I recommend that the press and public be excluded from the proceedings of the Pension Committee meeting during consideration of exempt item 11, cybersecurity policy, on the agenda, on the grounds that it is likely, in the view of the nature of the business to be transacted, that were members of the public to be present, there would be a disclosure of exempt information as defined in Schedule 12A, Part 3 to the Local Government Act 1972 as amended. Can we agree with that?
Agreed.
Okay. Right, so, yeah,